ViperStruck. Sometimes we feel ViperStruck. Paul's about to be ViperStruck. And this horrible act, this destructive thing where a viper strikes and puts his poison into Paul, is going to bring about an amazing thing for the community of Malta. I'm Pastor John from Living Stones and Sunland, Tujunga Seventh-day Adventist Churches. And as you've noticed, it's time for the call to prayer. We're almost to the end, my friends, of Acts. We're in chapter 28. Isn't it amazing? We started this in the midst of pandemico. You know, we were working it out one step at a time as we were looking for hope and new direction. And now here we are, gone so far, but not as far as Paul went. For Paul and the early Christians moved stronger, faster, and more powerfully than we could ever. In fact, they changed the world. But you know, you and I can change the world. It takes God to be there, though. I'm not going to pretend to be some kind of narcissist that thinks that I myself change the world, or I wish that somehow I change the world. Jesus does it, but he does it through you and through me. So in chapter 28, let's continue on. If you'll remember, the ship they were in was completely torn asunder. The sandbar, it was hit. Everyone got off and they swam for shore and they survived as the ship was destroyed and all of the stuff on the ship gone. If you remember, Jesus had come to Paul earlier and saying everything was going to be lost, but everyone on that ship will survive. And Paul had mentioned to everyone, including the soldiers, that we all will survive. We all will be okay. Don't worry. Not even one hair on our heads will be destroyed. All the stuff will be gone, but where there is life, there is hope. And so they hit the shore, and they all were cold. They all were wet at Malta, but they all were alive. As the dawn came up, it says in chapter 28, verse 1, we found out the island was called Malta. The islanders showed us unusual kindness as they built fire and welcomed us because it was raining and it was cold. So the welcoming had happened. In our lives, I mentioned this just this last week, that the anchor of our lives must be Jesus. You know, he will protect us. You know, the anchors that exist in this world cannot save us, but they can connect us with rocks below the sea. But the anchor of Jesus and faith in him is what gives us purpose to our lives. It holds and digs deep into the rock of Christ, the strength of the never-ending and always strong, powerful Christ who holds us fast. And so they come to Malta and their ship is destroyed, but they themselves are okay. Paul had caught that some of the soldiers were trying to, or should I say some of the captain and his crew were trying to get away, but the soldiers stopped them. So they were all together in one group. And as the fire was burning and everyone was trying to get close, Paul was helping try to build that fire. I like this, how Paul is. Many times, we as Christian pastors, I'm going to speak to my own ilk, right? We as Christian pastors and we leaders oftentimes want everybody else to do work for us. Go and take care of that. You sweep the floor. You do that. No. It doesn't work like that in the Bible. We work together. And Paul was doing the manual labor with everyone else. Even if Jesus spoke to him directly, he was out collecting the wood as well for the fire. Paul was gathering a pile of wood, of brushwood, and as he put it into the fire, there was a viper. A viper. Now, if you know anything about vipers, they're a snake. Pit vipers, they see because of infrared. Their eyes see infrared, so they can see you at night. They see your body heat. And this viper had been drawn out by the heat of the fire. You bet when the heat of the fire comes, it's a cold-blooded. He says, there's food up there. I can eat. So he starts to come out of his hole through the wood. And this viper that was driven out by the heat fastened itself to Paul's hand. So in other words, it struck Paul. Now, a pit viper has a terrible hemotoxin in it. That is the poison, and within moments, the person begins to die. Their skin begins to immediately, actually it's a neurotoxin, not a hemotoxin, but a neurotoxin. Immediately their entire nervous system begins to come apart. This thing struck at his hand and held tight to his hand, as always, because it has fangs with that poison that is injected into Paul. The viper strikes him with incredible power and pain. It fastened itself to his hand. When the islanders saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to each other, surely this man must be a murderer. So here they have an idea in their heads. They say, the ship went down, and the reason why it went down is probably because there was a bad person on the ship that took it down. But the only problem is these people were safe, so maybe this guy's a murderer, and maybe the goddess of justice, Themis, the Greek name Themis, perhaps she now is going to have justice with him, for he gets struck by the viper, and that it's hanging from his hand, and Paul is going like this with it. You know, he shakes it and shakes it. In fact, interestingly enough, if you read this text, it seems to you that it was on there for a little while. It wasn't just real fast, like shake, and it was done. It was like it was buried on, hung from his hand. They said, surely this man is a murderer, though he's escaped from the sea. The goddess of justice, Themis, the goddess of justice, has not allowed him to live. But Paul shook the snake off into the fire, shakes it off. It comes off and falls into the fire. And they watch him. And they watch him. And they watch him. And he continues to walk around, continues to survive, coming close to the fire and warming his hands, wiping his wounds, and he moves forward. My friends, in God's world, when bad things happen, it's not necessarily bad. When things happen that we don't like, and we're struck by a viper, sometimes, actually, I would say all the time, God is able to use it for good. If you and I are willing to allow ourselves to be used by that event for good. We like to think of bad things happening and good things happening in our lives. We like to think that when a good thing happens, that means God loves me. When a bad thing happens, what's wrong? Maybe God isn't blessing me. I would like to put it to you that when a bad thing happens and when a good thing happens, both those things are God using an event for good. But if we see it as an event that can be used for good, then our mind and our heart opens to being able to use that to build something better for the kingdom of heaven. But if we see the event happening as bad, then we lock ourselves to the pessimism that life is bad and maybe God doesn't support us. Let's take a look at what Paul does as we end here. The people expected, this is in verse 6, the people expected him to swell up or suddenly fall dead. But after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds. They said, he is a god. Of course, it goes to the opposite side. But we're dealing with ancient Greeks, right? On the island of Malta. There was an estate nearby that belonged to Publius, a chief official of the island. He welcomed us to his home. Notice the word us because we're referring to Luke, who's with Paul. Luke's all along been with him. Luke's been writing what's happening. The us is very interesting. Paul and him, and maybe someone else is also coming with. He welcomed us to his home and showed us generosity for 3 days. His father was sick in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went in to see him, and after he prayed, he placed his hands on him and healed him. Do you see what's happening here? The island of Malta now, because of a viper striking Paul, the ship going down, the viper striking Paul going through that terrible pain, and yet God saving him allowed for now the community to know God. An early Christian community can be set up there in Malta. There is no such thing as evil events, though there are events that can be seen as bad. Yeah. But it all has to do with our attitude. When the viper strikes us, do not allow yourself to be struck. Instead, allow God to strike back using his methodology, his good things. You can be a conduit, a straw, to bring the grace of Jesus from the cup to the mouth of this world. You can be that straw if you allow yourself to believe in him, not look at things as bad events, but instead look at things as hurdles so that we may show the grace of God to others. It's almost 7:15 right now. Time for intercession. I'll see you there, my friends.